Okay, welcome to the last video in the series defending the authority of the Bible that covers Old Testament prophecy. At this point, we have already covered Psalm 22, the suffering servant passage from Isaiah, and Daniel 9:24 through 25. Here, I will summarize other Old Testament prophecies about Christ, which is part 1. In part 2, I will summarize all the Old Testament prophecy that we have covered, and in part 3, I will give the implications of this. Let's start in part 1. The first 5 prophecies regard the Messiah's lineage. In short, the Messiah would descend from the line of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Jesse, and David, according to the Old Testament. Starting with Abraham, Genesis 12:3 says, "And I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." In the context, God is promising to make a great nation out of Abraham, and he says that, "In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Now at face value, it is not clear that he is talking about the Messiah, but this will become more clear as we go on. Next, we have Abraham's son Isaac. God reaffirms his promise to Abraham in Genesis 26:4, specifying that it was through Isaac that all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. He says, "I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and will give to your offspring all these lands, and in your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed." Then, in Genesis 28:14, God reaffirms his promise to Isaac's son Jacob, saying, "Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south, and in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed." Now the Apostle Paul makes the argument in Galatians 3:16 that the word seed, referring to Abraham's offspring, can be either singular or plural. And his point is that God's promise to Abraham is fulfilled in 2 ways. Abraham certainly was the father of a great nation and had many seeds, plural, but he was also the father, genealogically speaking, of Jesus the Messiah, and Jesus was Abraham's seed, singular. And since Christ opened the way to God, paying the price for anyone who believes in him, it was ultimately through this seed that the nations were blessed. So according to Paul, the verses from Genesis can refer to Christ or to Israel. However, Isaiah removes any doubt about the Messiah's lineage. Isaiah 11:1 through 2 says, "Then shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord." So here, Isaiah is saying that the Messiah, which is the shoot from the stump, will descend from Jesse. This is a messianic passage which we understand more fully when we look at verse 5, which says of the root, "And he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked." And we know that of Jesse's sons, that the Messiah would descend from David. Isaiah 9:7 says, "Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness, from this time forth and evermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this." So, the Messiah is prophesied to sit on the throne of David, which is probably what the Jews had in mind when they called Jesus the son of David in his triumphal entry. They were calling him the Messiah. Now, if we know that the Messiah descends from David, and that David descends from Jesse, Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham, then the Messiah must descend from these 2. This is why I said that Isaiah would make it more clear that the Messiah is prophesied to descend from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the Old Testament. And the New Testament fulfillment of these promises can be seen in the genealogies of Jesus in Matthew 1:2 through 6, and in Luke 3:31 through 34. But the Old Testament also prophesies about the Messiah's tribe and town. According to Genesis 49:10, the Messiah would be from the tribe of Judah. It says, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples." And it is pretty clear that Jacob, who is the one speaking here, is talking about the Messiah. Jesus fulfilled this when he was born in Bethlehem, which belongs to the tribe of Judah. By the way, if there was significant doubt in my opinion as to whether a verse talked about the Messiah, I did not include it in this video. That is why the number of prophecies I included is generally less than the figures you might hear from others. Moving on, the Old Testament says in Micah 5 verse 2 that the Messiah would be from the town of Bethlehem. It says, "But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from old, from ancient days." And it is pretty clear that the one whose coming forth is from old, from ancient days, is the Messiah. Some translations say from antiquity. So Micah is not talking about a mere human ruler. Jesus fulfilled this when he was born in the town of Bethlehem. And Isaiah 9:1 says that the Messiah would come from, or at least be associated with, Galilee. It says, "In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the latter time he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of nations." And we know that Jesus grew up in Galilee. The Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah's ministry. It says in Malachi 3:1 that the Messiah would be preceded by a messenger. It says, "Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple." And this messenger was John the Baptist, who preceded Christ's coming, preparing the way before him. And it is possible, though I am not sure, that Jesus fulfilled the part about the Lord coming to his temple, since he entered the temple repeatedly in his life. Isaiah 61, 1-2 says that the Messiah would proclaim good news. It is written from the Messiah's perspective and says, "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn." And this was fulfilled when Jesus proclaimed good news to the spiritually impoverished, to those who knew they needed a Savior. Moving on, Zechariah 9:9 says that the Messiah would ride a donkey into Jerusalem. It says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." And Jesus fulfilled this during his triumphal entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. Oddly enough, the timing of Palm Sunday was foretold in Daniel 9:24-25, to which I have dedicated an entire video in this series. So Jesus was fulfilling two prophecies at once. Moving on, Zechariah 12:10 says that the Messiah would be pierced. It says, "And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that, when they look on me, on him whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as one weeps over a firstborn." Oddly, the verse is written from God's perspective. He is the one talking, and he says that they will look on me, on him whom they have pierced. This implies that God, the one speaking, would take bodily form so as to be pierced. This God-man figure is elsewhere identified in the Old Testament as the Messiah. So this is a messianic passage. And this verse says that they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as one weeps over a firstborn. And I think this is referring to Israel's repentance in the last times, where they realize that they actually crucified their own Messiah. Interestingly, the suffering servant passage in Isaiah is written from the same perspective. In part 2, I will summarize all the Old Testament prophecies we have covered in this video series. In summary of the prophecy covered in this video, we know that the Messiah would descend from the line of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Jesse, and David. I have the Old Testament references alongside each prophecy. And the fulfillment in the life of Jesus is seen in the genealogies in Matthew and in Luke. We also know that the Messiah would be from the tribe of Judah, the town of Bethlehem, and the area of Galilee. We can see the fulfillment for the tribe of Judah and the town of Bethlehem in Luke 2:1-7, and the fulfillment for the area of Galilee in Matthew 2:22. And there are 4 prophecies about the Messiah's ministry covered here. The Messiah's ministry would be preceded by a messenger according to Malachi 3:1, and his ministry would involve the proclamation of good news according to Isaiah 61:1-2, and the Messiah would ride a donkey into Jerusalem according to Zechariah 9:9. The Messiah would also be pierced according to Zechariah 12:10, and I listed the New Testament fulfillment alongside the Old Testament prediction. In summary, the Old Testament predicts that the Messiah would be descended from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Jesse, and David, that he would be of the tribe of Judah, the town of Bethlehem, and the area of Galilee. The Messiah would proclaim good news, be preceded by a messenger, ride a donkey into Jerusalem, and be pierced. These are highly exclusive. For any one person to fulfill them would be strong evidence that they are, in fact, the Messiah, and that the Old Testament that predicts such details is inspired. But let us continue. Let's summarize what we covered in Psalm 22. Psalm 22 made around 29 predictions about the Messiah, and I selected to include here what I think are the 6 that are the hardest to dispute from a historical perspective. Psalm 22:6 says that the Messiah would be rejected by his own people, which we see fulfilled in Matthew 27:24-43, where Jesus was crucified, mocked, and humiliated by the Israel he came to save. Verses 7-8 say that the Messiah would be severely mocked, which is specifically seen in verses 39 and 43 of Matthew 27. In fact, the exact nature and phraseology of the mockery that Jesus received while on the cross is foretold 1,000 years before it happened in Psalm 22. According to verse 14, the Messiah would be poured out like water, which I took to mean bleed profusely. This is fulfilled in verses like Matthew 27:46, and by the crucifixion process in general. According to verse 16, the Messiah would have his hands and feet pierced, which is fulfilled in John 20:25-27. This is one of the most remarkable prophecies about the Messiah in the Old Testament. How could they have known that the Messiah would have his hands and feet pierced at least 500 years before crucifixion was invented? But moving on, the Messiah would be publicly humiliated according to verses 17 and 18, which again has its fulfillment in Matthew 27. And the Messiah would have his clothes divided through the casting of lots, according to verse 18. This was fulfilled in John 19:23-24. In summary, Psalm 22 predicts that the Messiah would suffer immensely, including severe mockings, public humiliation, profuse bleeding, pierced hands and feet, and rejection by his own people. He would have his clothes divided amongst his tormentors via the casting of lots. This is remarkably narrow and remarkably consistent with the life of Christ. But let us continue. In what is perhaps the most powerful Old Testament prophecy of the Messiah, known as the suffering servant passage, Isaiah 52:13-53:12 predicts in 52:14 and 53:11 that the Messiah would be brutally treated. 52:15 says that the Messiah would bleed profusely, that he would sprinkle many nations, which is a sacrificial term from the Old Testament, and both of these were fulfilled in the crucifixion of Christ. Crucifixion, as described in the video on Psalm 22, was a brutal process and was fully capable of producing the effects that were predicted in the Old Testament. According to 53:2, the Messiah would be like a root out of dry ground, which I took to mean that he would have unexpected beginnings. We see this fulfilled through the upbringings and timing of Jesus. According to 53:3, the Messiah would be rejected and would be a man of sorrows. The fact that he was rejected is fulfilled in verses like Luke 4:14-30, where Jesus was rejected in his hometown of Nazareth, and in verses like John 6:66. And we have numerous examples of Jesus enduring sorrow. According to verse 4, the Messiah would be thought to be a sinner, for it says that we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. This is truly unexpected, for the Messiah elsewhere is said to be the Savior of Israel, and yet here he is suffering for perceived sins. Why is this? Verse 5 answers us, saying that it was for our iniquities that he was crushed, not his own. The Messiah would be the substitute for sinners. The part about the Messiah being accused was fulfilled when Jesus was accused of sins like blasphemy or opposing the Mosaic law or the religious elite, the references for which are given. And it was for this, among other reasons, that he was crucified. Isaiah 53:7 says that the Messiah would be silent before his accusers, which was fulfilled in Mark 14:61 and through Jesus' general attitude of submission during his trial. Verse 8 says, "Who considered that he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people," which I think means that no one would remember him for what he truly accomplished by dying. This was the case, at least initially speaking, after Jesus died. No one seemed to recognize the true purpose for which he died, his disciples included. Isaiah 53 verse 9 says that the Messiah would have a grave with both the wicked and with the rich. Jesus' first grave was with the wicked when he died on the cross in between two robbers who justly deserved their fate. This was in John 19:30 through 33. And Jesus' second grave was with the rich in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, as seen in John 19:38 through 42. And according to verse 10, the Messiah would be resurrected, although it doesn't say it directly. It says that he shall see his offspring, and earlier, verse 8 says that he was cut off from the land of the living, meaning killed. The only way to explain this is through a resurrection. This was fulfilled in Luke 24:1 through 12, and through the ample amount of historical evidence that attests to Jesus' resurrection. I explain this in my video titled The Historical Evidence for Jesus' Resurrection, seen earlier in this video series. So in summary, Isaiah 52:13 through 53:12 predicts that the Messiah would have unexpected beginnings, have many sorrows, be misunderstood and largely rejected, submit himself to being brutally killed for alleged sins, have a grave with both the wicked and the rich, and be resurrected. All of these happened in the life of Christ. The accuracy of the Old Testament predictions and the precision with which Christ fulfilled them is a strong testament to both Jesus' messianic nature and the inspiration of the Old Testament that foretold his coming. In summary of Daniel 9:25 through 26, the Messiah would be recognized as the Messiah by Israel around April 4th, AD 32. This is seen in Daniel 9:25, and I arrive at this interpretation of verse 25 as well as calculate the date in my video on the topic. But Jesus' triumphal entry, which is the most reasonable fulfillment of verse 25, occurred on April 10th, AD 32, 6 days from when Daniel predicted it, 580 years in advance. Know that there is potential error in this calculation, but that none of it affects the conclusion. Daniel 9:26 says that after this, that the Messiah will be cut off, meaning killed. And this is seen in the crucifixion account of Jesus in Matthew 27, in which he was crucified 4 to 5 days after his triumphal entry. In summary, Daniel 9:25 through 26, according to the calculations in the Daniel 9 video, predicts the date of Jesus' triumphal entry with about 99.999% accuracy. It also predicts the unexpected fact that he would be killed after this. In part 3, I will summarize and give the implications of what we have covered. To understand how Old Testament prophecy is significant, imagine that someone predicts that one will come who has green hair, is wearing a vest, and has blue eyes, drives a white Honda Civic, grows up in Georgia, and is a direct descendant of George Washington. And within 1,000 years, someone who meets all of those predictions and more comes. And by the way, they also predicted when he would come with great accuracy. We would say that the person making the prediction is under the influence of some supernatural agent, right? And so it is with Old Testament prophecy, except that the predictions made about the Messiah are far more specific than what I just described. So here is a grand summary of Old Testament prophecy as covered in this video series, and I spliced together the different prophecies and added a word or two here and there to make it flow. So here it is. In summary, the Old Testament predicts that the Messiah would be descended from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Jesse, and David, and would be of the tribe of Judah, the town of Bethlehem, and the area of Galilee. And as his coming would be in an unexpected time and manner, he would be announced by a messenger. Although he would proclaim good news to the spiritually poor and ride a donkey into Jerusalem, he would be well acquainted with sorrow and grief, being misunderstood and largely rejected. After being recognized by Israel as the Messiah on April 10th, AD 32, he would be killed in a brutal manner for alleged sins. This death would include immense suffering, severe mockings, public humiliation, profuse bleeding, pierced hands and feet, rejection by his own people, and the dividing of his clothes via the casting of lots. After his death, the Messiah would have a grave with both the wicked and the rich, and be resurrected. And every single one of these details is directly or close to directly predicted in the Old Testament. To understand the significance of this, there was a researcher by the last name of Stoner who asked, what are the chances of any one person fulfilling 8 of the Old Testament prophecies about Christ? And I think there were technically 9, but these prophecies were that the Messiah would be born in Jerusalem, would be preceded by messenger, would enter Jerusalem on a donkey, would be betrayed by a friend, would have his hands and feet pierced, that the betrayer would be given 30 pieces of silver, that the betrayal money would be thrown into the house of God and used to buy a potter's field, that the Messiah would be silent before his accusers, and that he would die accounted among criminals. And I bolded the ones that are covered in this video series. The ones that were not bolded did not, in my view, make it clear that their intention was to predict something about the Messiah, which is why I did not include them. It is possible, though, that I am wrong. I try to err on the conservative side so as to not overstate my case. But that does not affect Stoner's conclusion. He determines that the probability of any one person living between the time the prophecy was written and the time that he made the calculations fulfilling these prophecies was about 1 in 10 to the 17th power. That is a 10 with 17 zeros after it. He says that if we covered the entire state of Texas in silver $half to about 2 feet deep, that would be about 10 to the 17th coins. And the probability that any one person would fulfill 8 of the Old Testament prophecies is the probability of labeling any one of these coins and drawing it out at random. So Stoner says the fulfillment of these 8 prophecies alone proves that God inspired the writing of these prophecies to a definiteness which lacks only 1 chance in 10 to the 17th power of being absolute. And that is just for 8 or 9 of the prophecies. In the summary I just gave, there were 29. Stoner calculated the probability for 48 messianic prophecies and determined it to be 1 in 10 to the 157th power. Now there are about 10 to the 80th atoms in the universe. So if we took each atom in our present universe and made each one of them into a universe of its own, we would have 10 to the 80th universes and 10 to the 160th atoms. The chance of drawing any one of these atoms at random is the chance that these prophecies would come true randomly. If them coming true randomly is not likely, then it is likely that they came true by design. That means that they are inspired. And yet, to many, the probability of inspiration is not just 1 in 10 to the 160th power, but 0. That is, the possibility of the supernatural is systematically ruled out before the debate begins, making one impervious to the evidence. Now, to be fair, I think the number that Stoner gave may have been a little high because Jesus clearly went out of his way to fulfill some of them. That is, Jesus wasn't a random agent. I discussed this in detail toward the beginning of the video on Psalm 22. On the other hand, however, Stoner calculated the probability of any one person fulfilling them until the time that he lived, not the time that Jesus lived. So, Stoner is including the last 2,000 years worth of people, which is many times greater than the number of people that lived in the Old Testament times leading up to Jesus. And that would have strengthened his conclusion. But I don't think any of these critiques affect the conclusion. So what should we do with this knowledge? Well, I think there are some obvious spiritual implications. For example, Jesus is the substitute for sin, because the same suffering servant passage that says the Messiah would have a grave with both the wicked and the rich, that says he would be horribly treated for alleged sins, also says that this man is the substitute for sinners. That means that through faith in Jesus, a person can be made right with God, that their sins can be paid for. We can also deduce that if Jesus is the Messiah, then he is also capital G God, meaning Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament. This is because the Old Testament, in verses like Psalm 45, 6-7, and in Isaiah 9, 6, equates the Messiah with God. So if Jesus is the Messiah, then he is God. Combine this with prophecies like the suffering servant passage to yield that God took on human flesh to die in the place of sinners. That is incredible, isn't it? and all of it is foretold hundreds of years in advance. We can trust that Christ intercedes on behalf of sinners like Isaiah 53:12 says he does, and this point is reiterated in Hebrews 7. This means that those who trust in his sacrifice can enjoy the benefits of an eternal relationship with their Creator. No longer do they have to go through a high priest that is merely human. The high priest is fully human and fully God, which allows him to intercede on our behalf. And the same prophecies about Christ's first coming also say that he will come back again, but this time it won't be to pay the price for sin. It will be to save those who love him, destroy those who oppose him, and set up his earthly kingdom forever and ever. If one does not belong to Christ, if they are not yet a Christian, I encourage them to genuinely and honestly consider the things in these videos and the truths presented in the Bible. Even if they are false, it is better to be safe than sorry. And if they are true, as the evidence suggests, then it was certainly worth one's time to investigate. What is not an option is to refuse to look at the evidence because of where it might lead. That is all. In the next video, I will present an implicit but no less powerful argument for the Old Testament's inspiration. This is one of my favorite topics and concerns Old Testament types. That is, the characters, events, and rituals that foreshadow Christ and his work. I hope to see you there. Thank you for watching.